As the environment editor, I thought it would be interesting to explore how the stories come to you. I mean, are the reporters work under you and just yourself?
No, there's editor is an honorific title in this case, I think, because I don't actually edit anything. I mean, I have no page, I have no guaranteed slot or space in the paper. There's nobody working under me in that sense. I mean, there are various other reporters who also cover elements of the environment as well, to do with, for example, motorway development and, controversies about that and other things, like, what the city council is planning, in relation to, say, the free bike scheme, or not the rental bike scheme, I don't want to say it's free, and stuff like that. And so there's, and even, for example, stuff that would be issued by the Environmental Protection Agency or to do with licensing of waste facilities like the proposed incinerator in Rings End and so on. So, like there's such a wide amount of stuff, there's such an enormous amount of stuff going on, even still, that, one person just couldn't cover it at all. And I do a lot of travelling which is work related, particularly in relation to the climate. So, I'm away quite a bit.
Now, how do stories come to you, and how are stories selected by you to cover? Do they come to you from other people or from?
Yeah, I mean, there's, people get in touch. They find out your email address and they send you an email saying, we're having this terrible problem here. Now, sometimes it can be very local, and it's not something that a national newspaper like the Irish Times could reasonably take up. And in any case, there isn't enough hours in the day or days in the week, to deal with all of this stuff that concerns people individually. So, but that would be one thing. And also, I have a because I've been at this for so long, I know so many people in this whole extended area of the environment and the protection of it, and even people who are doing damage to it. I know them too. So I have a wide variety of sources and contacts as well.
Now, do you? I mean, people are always pitching stories to you.
Yeah.
Do you find a difference in the way in which the story is pitched to you from, say, an industry representative versus an environmental group and versus the government?
Well, of course, because the industry side would normally have a PR company. The thing would be very polished. There'd be no loose ends. There'd be, and they'd be trying to interest you in covering their angle of whatever the story is. But there's nearly always two sides to an issue, and frequently the objectors, say some community group or environmental organisation, would be quite wrong-footed and at a disadvantage because they don't have access to professional resources, whether it's PR companies or other consultants. Frequently, it's difficult for them even to hire a planner, to present their case, say at an oral hearing in front of An Bord Pleanála or whatever. And yet that's important. It's important that those cases are stated, and there's very little funding for objectors in this country. We just don't have a tradition of doing that. I mean, the government is very loath to give money to people who are objecting to things because frequently the government is in favour of the things that they're objecting to. So why should they give them any money?
Do you get pitched stories from the government, from the EPA or other government agencies?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, there'd be regular stuff from the EPA. There's also decisions being issued by planning authorities and by An Bord Pleanála. There's press releases on a daily basis from the Department of the Environment, the Department of Energy, or Communications, Energy and Natural Resources, and other sources like the Office of Public Works and all sorts of other people.
Now, what would you?
You'd be inundated. In fact,
you would.
You would be inundated. Yeah, I would be certainly.
And what do you need from? I mean, how would you explain to somebody in the environmental groups who are less sophisticated, less training, less resources, as to what information you need to make a decision as whether this is a story that should be followed or not?
Well, that's a hard one, really. I mean, I don't have any particular advice to give them, except that, in fairness, they now have a network which has a few permanent staff people who are relative experts, on what's going on. and so they're a little bit more professional, or somewhat more professional than they would have been even a few years ago. Well, say 10 years ago. So, but it's very hard. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily advise them on it. Sometimes you get something that's so badly put together that it would drive you around the twist to try and make sense of it.
So you just need a focused.
You need
focused.
People need to be very clear about what it is they're trying to say, and what they're trying to achieve. And if they're not, if the whole thing is full of guff, and particularly also if they send you too much stuff, that in itself becomes intimidating.
Too much information.
Too much information. It's just total overload. I mean, most stories in the paper would be no more than 500 or 600 words as news stories. So we can't tell the history of the world on a daily basis.
Now, talk about a couple stories that you've covered in the past that would be interesting to revisit. At the Chaos at the Crossroads, which you did with James Nix.
That's right.
Which was basically about planning process, and you didn't pull too many punches with Fianna Fáil's involvement in that.
No.
And some of the quotes were Fianna Fáil's attitude towards sustainable development is development that needs to be sustained.
Absolutely, yeah. That was Bertie Ahern's. That was my interpretation of Bertie Ahern's alleged commitment to sustainable development.
And the one-off housing, you said it was just a free-for-all.
Yeah, total and utter. Yes.
And with regard to the Fianna Fáil-led government record on EU environmental directives, you called it atrocious.
Atrocious, yeah.
Do you see any change? That was 2005. Your book. Do you see any changes in?
Yes, there have been, because the great thing about Europe is that it has a habit of creeping up on you if you don't fall into line. Now, some people might regard that as an interference with our so-called sovereignty, but I welcome it very much, because I think the progress that we have made on the environmental front in Ireland would not have been made if it wasn't for the requirement that we are obliged to fulfill. To comply with EU directives, whether it's on waste management or water quality, or a whole range of there's about, there's something like 60 directives that have environmental implications, and if you don't comply with them, they haul you over the coals, and you could end up in front of the European Court, and if you fail to implement a European Court judgment, you can be subject to fines on a daily basis, as Greece has been and other European Union member states. So that is a powerful incentive for any government, particularly one that's strapped cash-wise, to actually do the basic work that needs to be done, even though it's going to cost loads of money in some cases. I mean, for example, on waste management, it certainly would, or on in terms of the remediation of sites, or water quality. To bring that all up to the proper standard is an expensive business, and there's hundreds of millions being put into that.
And do you think the Green Party has brought some balance to Fianna Fáil on that issue?
Yes. I mean, for example, on the planning legislation that John Gormley has announced, but it hasn't been published as of this moment. Essentially, what that's trying to do is to restrain the power that's currently exercised by local councillors to change development plans to suit particular vested interests, and that had reached its extreme zenith in Dublin County Council in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the place was like a cross between, as I described it, an estate agency and a pork belly futures market. Because land was being rezoned, as we now know, and suspected at the time, corruptly by councillors. And in fact, it wasn't just Fianna Fáil, there were others involved from Fine Gael and even from the Labour Party. I mean, there were a couple of councillors who left the Labour Party so that they could climb on the rezoning bandwagon.
So there is some optimism with the European.
I think so, yes. And also, the Greens have had an impact in government in terms of, putting a focus on the carbon issue and the need to reduce our carbon footprint.